Well, ladies and gentlemen, the G20 is finally over. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing or what, but I mean, I suppose it's over, and so let's actually look at what the whole thing did, and was it even worth all of the airtime and all of the embarrassment and so forth. But before we get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. You know the drill, guys. Come on, man, just subscribe to the channel. And actually, for members of the channel, I do members-only content for members only, morning shots and higher. And I recently did a new video around a film review on the new Running Man film, which I must be honest and say, please don't ever watch. It's so terrible. In any case, let's get on to the G20 debate. So the G20 has been described as being the most dramatic and geopolitically significant in years. I'm really not sure how it was, but we'll talk about that in a sec. The US boycotted it, and China was quietly rebuked. I mean, they say quietly rebuked. They did one little line about how China is not that great. And then the media lost their mind, and they were like, oh my God, somebody said something negative about China. And Europe just sat there saying that South Africa was great. Like, it just went over and over and over again. South Africa is great. And I've got to say that the media in South Africa was just, the coverage of this entire event was just awful. It really felt to me like, what were these guys doing? I mean, it was like, what were they trying to do? Join Ramaphosa's harem or something? Like, it was just terrible because they were just like, against all expectations, Ramaphosa was majestic again. And he pulled off such a clean diplomatic victory. And apparently he outmaneuvered all the global powers. He said that Africa dominated the agenda. And then they all talked about the declaration. Remember the declaration that Trump said, please don't do? And what the actual declaration means for the future. But, you know, I'm assured that this declaration was just something voluntary. It doesn't bind everybody. And everybody lost their mind over the fact that Ramaphosa did one anyway. So the actual first thing that they noted was around the divided states of the world. And so was the war in Ukraine, the Middle Eastern crisis. And then they talked about protectionism. So protectionism was a veiled swipe at, well, Trump administration protecting their own economy. And then the green agenda, also known as the watermelon agenda. That's green on the outside, red in the middle. And the whole climate disasters, because everything these days has to include the climate. Now, the Trump's White House was highlighted as having escalated tensions and having pushed unilateralism and dismissed multilateral forums. So that's basically the idea that the entire world has to be run by some kind of forum like the UN, which South Africa seems to really be getting into this whole globalist bull rubbish. Now, South Africa hosted the G20 for the first time on African soils. Never been done on African soils before, so accordingly, this was rather big pressure, and that's why Ramaphosa stayed on. He wanted to stay on for the G20 so that he could make history. Remember, the first black African leader to host the G20. Now, domestically, like here in South Africa, we still have coalition instability. We've got infrastructure failures coming out of our bejeebers, and there's high skepticism of politics as a whole. And internationally, Ramaphosa faced loads of threats from Trump, the US-South Africa diplomatic fractions. Remember, we still have tariffs and we still don't have a trade agreement. And there was the expectation that the US's absence would somehow collapse the summit. And that's why Ramaphosa very early on went through to get like the G100, where they just invited everybody, because their idea was, well, you have power in crowds, you have power in the mob. So if you get everybody through, they'll all somehow just have to, like, we'll just have to accept it because majority rules, because that's what democracy is now in 2025. It's majoritarianism. But in any case, Ramaphosa immediately started this off, the whole thing, and just said, we must adopt the G20 declaration. Like, I haven't even had the G20 yet, and he's like, let's adopt the declaration. Now, this was very specific because the US said, don't, because we're not there, so there's no point in actually doing this declaration because we're going to follow it anyway. So the cameras are rolling, everybody's looking at him, and you could see ministers try to stop Ramaphosa. They were like, this is diplomatically done. And he was like, nope, adopt the declaration right now. And he got unanimous consensus, well, obviously minus the US. And then everybody like lost their minds and clapped like seals, like, yeah. And everybody else was stunned because they were like, this is strategically stupid. And the media was like, it's a tactical masterstroke. What it really means is like, we have no interest in the Americans. And so we're just going to ignore everything they say. So it's stupid. Now, Trump initially announced that he would just boycott the summit. Now, you know this. At the last minute, the US Embassy tried to, according to the media, save face. And that's because Ramaphosa said he was going to hand over the baton for the next G20 to an empty chair. Now, apparently, they sent a note to South Africa demanding to arrange security for a low-level diplomat to attend the closing ceremony. So basically, they couldn't embarrass the Americans. Now, they wanted some junior officials to receive the G20 presidency on America's behalf, but South Africa refused. And Ramaphosa said this was unprecedented because you can't have protocol bent for one country. It's always going to go to a senior individual, like a president or an ambassador or something. You can't just send a junior official. So he started off the entire thing, the entire G20, by saying the Americans are not coming. He said that there's no US presence at all, and the handover will happen quietly, later in Pretoria. And according to the media, this was a symbolic humiliation for Washington and a massive assertion of South Africa's sovereignty. No, it wasn't. It was just like diplomatic bull rubbish on the whole stage for everybody to see. And everybody felt like it was children arguing in the audience, and nobody really wants to see the parents having arguments. It's just really wasn't that great. Now, what was that G20 declaration? Well, the G20 declaration mentions Africa 80 times. 80. What's a record in terms of the forum? Now, this should be unsurprising because it occurred in Africa. And to a degree, this is arguably why the Americans didn't actually want to come, because it was going to be a Africa-centered G20. And Trump's trying to do an America-first focus. So, why would you want to go talk about Africa when you want to deal with your own country? Now, the themes of the declaration were effectively set by South Africa, and they were as follows. They were the African debt crisis, climate adaptation, critical minerals, infrastructure investment, inclusive markets, and food security. Now, inclusive markets for me is just hilarious, because at the weekend, the ArcelorMittal, the collapse of it, has led to numerous other suppliers of minerals to ArcelorMittal. They were collapsing. Because we all knew that once the value chain collapsed, because of ArcelorMittal's collapse as a smelter, the consequences would be huge. And so we have this inclusive markets. And then they asked, why is the market in South Africa for this product collapsed? And they said, well, China creates it at $103 and we produce it at $112. So China's cheaper. And that's why China gets it, because everybody wants cheap rubbish. So how do you have inclusive markets when your market's being absolutely obliterated by one country who's able to produce these things cheap? So they asked them why. Why is China able to produce this cheaply? They said, well, because China subsidizes the electricity to their industry so that they can be very competitive. And they said, well, why doesn't South Africa do this? And they said, well, South Africa promised that they would, but they never did. So maybe we should have some of that protectionism that apparently Ramaphosa says America has, and now it's terrible. You can't have inclusive markets and infrastructure investment and what, when you don't protect your own markets. This is what Trump came to recognize. Being a globalist stooge doesn't help you one bit. Now, Ramaphosa positioned Africa as not just a charity case, but as being central to global stability. And I've got to ask you, how is it central to global stability when the majority of countries in Africa are not democracies, don't have functioning economies, don't have big infrastructures, don't have big militaries, and a majority of them are currently in active war zones because of political disputes, which has led to forms of civil war. The top part of Africa is all being overtaken by Islamist groups who are slaughtering the local populations in the name of Allah. The global stability is being affected by Africa. It's not responsible for global stability. Again, stupid. Now, he said that Africa's development is essential to global peace, global markets, and global investment. The reality is that Africa will be the largest supplier of people within the next 20 years. They will vastly eclipse every other continent. So in that position, yes, it will be responsible for global peace, because with that amount of people, can't have them shifting abroad in terms of large-scale migration. It will collapse countries it already is. So what are we talking about, right? So he says that Europe and Asia echo this. So of course they echo this because they can see the mass migration. And so the South African presidency elevated the global south and restored multilateralism, because apparently if we all get the UN or the globalist claptrap, apparently somehow everything will be great. Globalism solves everything, says the globalists. Now, South Africa pushed hard to get the cost of African debt onto the agenda. And the G20 admits that interest payments for low-income countries have more than doubled, and credit ratings penalize Africa unfairly. Now, apparently there's no concrete relief from this. So they all sat there and had a little cry about it, and they all said, oh, terrible, we have to pay interest. And nobody knows what to do about it because you've got to pay for interest, I'm afraid. Now, former Goldman Sachs Africa head calls it a missed opportunity for a historic reset, because this is what everybody wanted. They just wanted Africa's debt to be written off. But you can't write off that amount of debt without collapsing whole global economy. It should be logical. Apparently it never is. So the political win is that Africa's debt crisis is now a formal global priority, which no one knows how to bloody pay, because the only way to actually pay it is to grow your economy, to have capitalist societies, and to have some form of regularity in terms of your politics and your legal systems, which Africa doesn't have. We have a bunch of despots running many countries with many forms of communist agendas. There's a high degree of socialism that impacts all of Africa, and it's that collapses economies. And the very countries that have abandoned, such as Angola and Rwanda, well, they've all seen economic growth. And that comes as no surprise, because once you actually have the policies in place that allow growth, you tend to get growth. Now, the declaration introduces a critical mineral framework, which is basically a voluntary blueprint for governance and benefaction. Now, tucked into the language is a subtle but unmistakable dig at China. And basically what it says is that multilateral trade measures are inconsistent with WTO rules. Now, effectively, what that effectively means is that the way that China is going through and doing all their trade measures, they're saying that China is breaching WTO rules, which is kind of true. Now, the warning against export restrictions that disrupt supply chains is basically a reference to Beijing's recent restricted rare earth exports, which caused global panic. Now, many US analysts are calling this a major departure from the first G20 language, which scrutinized China's minerals behavior. But you see, even when I'm describing this to you, I'm almost willing to bet that the majority of you are listening to even what I'm saying here, going, I don't really know what I'm listening to, because the language was just like so bull rubbish. What it basically means is that China just stops exporting things when they want to. They disrupt supply chains as they feel fit. They disrupt supply chains in terms of how they deal with countries, in terms of what they'll pay them and how they deal with things from terms of the value addition. And they will, as they feel fit, just stop buying or shipping raw materials. And it causes problems globally because it's difficult for markets to function when there's no predictability. But the way that they couched that in their language was multilateral trade measures are inconsistent with WTO rules. So like everybody knew what they're talking about, but nobody has the balls to actually say, China, you're messing things up here. Can you not be a dick? Now, you can't say, well, it's just because they were being political and they weren't wanting to use overtly hostile language, because they are very happy, and they were very happy to criticize Trump throughout all of this and used very openly hostile language towards the US. So the declaration ultimately praised South Africa for its energy security toolkit. I mean, it'd be nice if we actually had energy security, but anyway, some food security task force, even though we have a country where lots of people starve to death, and infrastructure pipeline toolkits, even though our infrastructure is collapsing. Yeah. But some analysts warned that South Africa itself fails to meet all these standards. Well, I'll never, because of governance, corruption, job creation, poverty reduction, and energy stability. And South Africa is praised as a global architect, but a domestic underperformer. Statement of the century, that one. Now, quotes from multiple leaders show exactly how they all felt about the G20. Apparently, Turkey says, we return home with many beautiful memories. This was a successful summit. Wow. Amazing. The Netherlands said South Africa's role is extremely important. Multilateralism matters. Yes, globalism great. Fantastic. The EU said, yep, the EU, because apparently they're just like representative of themselves. Multilateralism is not outdated. South Africa put multilateralism to work. Yes, the diplomatic mess that is the EU says that diplomatic messes like the EU are great. So these statements were apparently to show broad alignment with South Africa's agenda, even without the US. Because the US doesn't want to be subjected to the globalist bull rubbish. I mean, it's so dull. South Africa branded the summit as the people's G20. Always the people with communists until they're in power, and then it's the state, because the state very rarely cares for the people. Now, during the G20, there were 130 meetings, thousands of delegates, civil society went, business went, labor was involved, and ultimately the entire narrative was how to build national pride, which they'd start with South Africa. And apparently this was all to show South Africa as an emerging global broker. But I've said this before, South Africa's population and our GDP is like minute. So I don't know how we become a global broker. We don't have the population to justify that position. So you say, okay, well, how much peace did they negotiate in Ukraine and Russia? Oh, wait, they didn't. How much peace did they negotiate between Gaza and Israel? Oh, wait, they didn't do that one either. So apparently they were all there to unify national achievements and to get everybody back together. But they can't do it themselves, even when they've tried to insert themselves in global conflict. They never saw anything out. So obviously, Ramaphosa framed the entire summit as a defense of shared humanity against global division. Hey, what about the divisions at home, buddy? How about having a defense of our shared humanity? Like, I don't know, stop putting laws in place that restrict wide economic movement and, saying that the killing of Boers isn't really that much of a problem, who cares? Like, how about fix your own economy first before you look at everybody else's? So Ramaphosa obviously did a speech, and during it, he said, he emphasized inclusive economic growth. Yeah, how many times have we heard that just in my little rant? Like, this is all these people talk about, inclusive economic growth, which is another way of saying transformation, which is another way of saying BEE, which is another way of saying just give black people jobs and screw everyone else. He then said disaster risk integration into macroeconomic policy was really important because the disaster risk mitigation is COVID, basically. We need to have things like the WHO, which South Africa wanted to sign the pandemic treaty, but the rest of the world didn't. So yeah, there's that. So the climate justice and support for vulnerable countries was necessary, and that technological access for developing nations was needed. Because this is what they say at the moment. Like, you remember the climate justice, because it's got to be justice now, the green agenda, also known as the renewable agenda. See how they have all these nice little buzzwords for the same bull rubbish? Well, they get money for that, and they want more money for it. Because the more money they can get for it, the more they can scam from it, and the more it becomes a scam. So, yeah, climate justice. And they want technological access for developing nations because they can't actually develop themselves. We saw this during COVID with our own medical plants. Remember, we couldn't actually produce vaccines on site. So we needed the tech to do it. And they lobbied the rest of the world to make the vaccine public domain information and not to be the exclusive property of the pharmaceuticals, so that they could create their own. We even had a plant in PE that we created to produce these and never produced one. Despite having a big, huge red ribbon opening ceremony, we never actually produced any vaccines in it. So, technological access. Anyway, global early warning systems. Now, the global early warning systems are basically going to be floods. And let us not forget that Durban flooded because they didn't do or maintain any of the flood defenses in Durban. But yeah, it's the climate's problem. It's not actually that they just didn't maintain the infrastructure. So food security as a global priority. He talked about that too. Even though we are putting a lot of farmers out of business by expropriating their property, buying it with willing buyer, willing seller, even though all the economics and the policies and the BE bull rubbish means that it's not economically viable to run your farm anyway. Because of that, food prices in South Africa have gone up and we have a lot of people dying from starvation. But food security is a priority. But next week we're going to expropriate farms without compensation. Yeah. Anyway. He said, a just transition that protects workers, poor communities, and women. You know what this guy really should be talking about? Is how, in the future, AI is going to mean that a large amount of these underpaid workers, they all want these workers' rights, won't have jobs. all get done by AI, all get done by robotics. Then what are they going to do? Yeah, we're still talking about the economy as if it's like a 1920s model with workers in factories, with no AI, no computers. Everybody still writes their letters to each other. Like we all go to the post office to post our letters, and we all go to the bank and put our checks in there. Like this isn't the way the world works anymore. There's a high degree of automation. And so in the future, you ain't going to be able to protect workers because there ain't going to be any. Anyway, he said that multilateralism is the only way to survive a century of shocks. Yeah, we're all going to be in it together, remember? So we're going to loot our country dry, but as long as we're all in it together, we can loot your countries dry too. So what was the takeaway from all this? Well, according to the media, the US's boycott backfired and isolated Washington, and Africa is now structurally embedded into the G20's governance. China's power in critical minerals is facing global pushback. South Africa demonstrated unusual diplomatic agility and leadership, and the global south has consolidated its influence. So multilateralism, the idea that the UN and globalism would just like destroy all of our lives, everybody thought that was dying because Trump brought back the nation and the idea that we need to protect the nation. But apparently no, multilateralism, globalism is showing resilience. I gotta say, it's showing resilience with the people who like it, the elites. But on the ground, nations don't like this. And nations at one point or another have a habit of overthrowing their governments and putting them all under guillotines like they did in France. So the fact that the elites are telling us, yes, globalism is great, whilst everybody else's nation state, the people who live there, are telling them to footsack, tells me these people are tone deaf, and at some point the pendulum's going to swing the other way. And all this bull rubbish that they think they're talking about is going to have disastrous consequences for them, because countries don't want to keep putting up with this. You can sit there saying all this globalist rubbish on and on and on and on. What matters is whether countries grow and people have jobs, and they don't. And as things become automated, there will be less jobs. As industries collapse under the weight of China and the way that China undercuts local economies, this is going to lead to more job losses, and it's going to pee people off. And the consequences of that, the diplomatic consequences locally, domestically, are going to be disastrous. But the ANC and all the other globalists are too stupid to notice it. At least that's my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until tomorrow, bye.